In this video, I want to talk a little bit about Genesis chapter 1 and part of chapter 2. As you read in the Corey text, you realize that there are actually two creation accounts in the first couple of chapters of Genesis. Read that thoroughly before looking at this video, watching the video, and hopefully it will help you understand it better. Also, if you can take this time to pause the video, I know I just started, but if you'd pause it and then read the text of Genesis chapter 1 and 2. It is on Blackboard. Take a look at the text. As you read the text, note words or phrases that are repeated over and over. There are quite a few of them. Circle them or highlight them. So right now, pause the text and read through it. Make notes on the text and try to look at it as closely as you can to spot patterns and to try to understand it. We'll be back in just a minute. What patterns did you see? What words did you see? If you have questions about the text, why don't we do a Blackboard discussion board, and that way if you have questions or comments about the text, we can do that. So take a look at Blackboard and see that particular discussion board. I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have, or email me. That's okay. When you look at a text like this and you see patterns and words repeated over and over and over, what kind of text is that? What's the nature of that text? Stop for a second and think about if you had a text that wasn't a biblical text and you were reading through it and it had repetition of words and ideas and phrases. What type text would you say that would be? Most would say that looks like a poem. So when we look at this text and try to understand it and try to interpret it, what you first need to do is to understand what is the very nature of this text. And so if you see it as poetic, how do you interpret that text? Many times within the Christian traditions, persons try to look at this text and interpret it literally and say, this text is trying to tell us that the world was created in 6 days. However, if that's really not the nature of the text or the type text it is or the intent of the text, then you really can't draw that conclusion. So let's look closely at that. If you're looking at a poem, how do you interpret it? Do you look at it literally? Sometimes you might, but many times you don't. I'm not an expert in poetry by any means, but when you look at a text that looks like a poem, how do you interpret it? You have to look at it like a poem. For example, several years ago, I worked with a student on a project and we presented a paper at a national conference, and the paper was on hip-hop after Katrina. So we looked at a lot of the hip-hop songs that came out after Katrina to see what themes and ideas they were emphasizing, and we looked at this artist. You probably are familiar with him, Lil Wayne. And one of his songs, I was examining the lyrics, and I noticed he said, "When I open my mouth, all bullets fall out." Well, if I were to look at that text and try to examine it, would I really believe that bullets fall out of Lil Wayne's mouth when he talks? Imagine if I went to a concert and he sang that song, and after the concert I said to him, "Excuse me, Mr. Wayne, you said in one of your songs that when you open your mouth all bullets fall out, but that didn't happen. So I think you're trying to pull something over on us. I think you're lying, Mr. Wayne, and I really don't appreciate that." I don't think he would appreciate that conversation, right? So when we look to the creation account, what we need to do is understand the type of document or work it is. And so if you noticed, there are quite a few patterns. But let's look first of all at what happens on the individual days, and then we'll see a little bit more about the patterns. So on day 1, light appears, right? Day 2, what comes up? The sea and the sky, right? So that's what's created on day 2. Day 3, dry land is created. Now this is where it gets kind of interesting. Day 4, what is created? Stars and the moon. Interesting, because day 1 you have light, but on day 4 you have stars and the moon. Where was the light before that? Day 5, you have fish and birds. I've heard it in a sermon, fish and fowl, because you know how preachers like to alliterate sometimes. Day 6, humans and animals are created. Now, what pattern do you see here? Sometimes students get this and sometimes they don't. Notice on day 1, we have light, and it's fulfilled by the stars and the moon. Day 2, sea in the sky. Well, you can't have fish and birds if you don't have a place for them, right? Sea in the sky. Day 3, you got land. You can't have humans and animals without land. So what the writers are telling us here is that there's a purpose behind God's creation. That God didn't just randomly create stuff. Didn't create stars and the moon and fish and birds without creating something for them to exist in. So even in this pattern, the writer is telling us something about God and creation. That creation is not random, and that God had a purpose for everything that exists. So when you look at Genesis chapter 1 and try to interpret it, you have to realize, what's the intent of the authors? What is the purpose? What's going on here? Is the author really just trying to tell us that the world was created in 6 days? Or is the author, by this particular pattern, saying specific things about creation and the God who created it? Let's talk a little bit about the liturgical pattern. Liturgy are those elements generally found in worship that bring us communion with God. So, prayer is a liturgical event within the worship service, right? That's an aspect of the liturgy. Prayer gets us closer to God. When we say the Apostles' Creed, that draws us closer to each other and affirms what we all believe together. So liturgy has a purpose of drawing us near to God, telling us things about God so that we can understand God more closely. All right, so what is the first part of the liturgical pattern? If you look at the text, the first thing that generally happens on these days is that the world is, or aspects of the world or creation, are created simply because God speaks them into existence. Now, what is the author trying to tell us about God here? That this God just speaks and stuff happens. Demonstrates the power of God. That everything that is in existence is a result of God speaking it into existence. There's no struggle like in the Enuma Elish. God just creates, God just speaks, and it happens. Next, we have an affirmation. On many days, it says, it is good, as you read through that. At the end, it said, it is very good. What is this saying about creation? It's saying that creation is good, and that a good God has created this good stuff. We'll read later in Genesis that humans do some pretty rotten things, but what the writer of Genesis chapter 1 is trying to tell us is that ultimately we are good, and ultimately all of creation is good because God created it. Manipulation. If you look at what the text says on those particular days, you can almost visualize God moving things with God's hands, or being involved, bringing humans from the dust. So this manipulation generally is to show that God is active within creation rather than distant. Several years ago, before you were born probably, there was a song that Bette Midler sang, and in the lyrics it said, God is watching us from a distance. That is not the picture of God in Genesis chapter 1. This God is present within creation, moving among creation, and very active. And so the Israelites were telling us that God is in the midst of God's creation. Naming is also very important in the Old Testament. If you'll notice, Adam later on will name the animals. Many scholars suggest that this demonstrates ownership, that God owns us, or owns all of creation, that God is closely connected to creation. However, God owns creation and it belongs to God. Transition just means we're going from one day to the next, right? There's no deep theological aspect of that portion of the text. You also read in Corey about the Enuma Elish and the Memphite stories, and part of what you were to look at or to understand in the Corey text here is that there were many stories created by communities at this time, and the intent of the stories were not to correct other stories in terms of their historical accuracy or their scientific accuracy. What the writers of Genesis were trying to do is tell the other communities that our God is more powerful than your God and better than your God, and we're better than you are. So if you look through that Enuma Elish story in the text, you see that you have this Tiamat goddess who seems to be on a rampage and kind of crazy, and Marduk gets the other gods together and kills Tiamat and her husband and creates the world from their bodies. And in the Enuma Elish story, humans are created from the blood of Kingu, and their job is to perform menial tasks for the gods. Now, one part of the text that I kind of disagree with Corey about here is Corey says that all of these myths, humans were created last and were created to serve the gods. Well, in the case of Genesis, that's true. However, what did it say about humans in that text? That text says that humans are created in the image of God and they're given dominion over the earth. So that is one way of the Israelite community saying our God has given us dominion over this earth. We're not here as slaves. We have power over all of creation, and that was a gift from God. Also think about the differences between the gods. The Hebrews or Israelite gods, the God of the Hebrews, didn't struggle with anybody, right? There was not a battle between Yahweh there was not a battle between Yahweh and other gods, right? The God of the Hebrews just speaks and creates, whereas the other communities around them, their gods had been engaged in battles with other gods, and there are many gods around them. So the Hebrews could look to these other communities and say, our God is so powerful that our God doesn't struggle with anybody. And when you look out to the sky and you see all of these places for gods to live, and the sun and the moon and the stars are things that are worshipped by you. For us, those are just lights put out there to guide us by our God, and God spoke that into existence. So it's a little our God's better than your God, and also a little bit of we're better than you are. We're not slaves. We are created in the image of God to rule over the earth. Now, what's the purpose of the text? Is it to provide a scientific explanation of the origin of everything, or is it to say a lot about the Hebrews' God and a lot about the Hebrew people and how they are different than others around them? You can pause it here and read through this, but I would also ask you to look at the Corey text and really try to understand the function of understanding Genesis as a myth. Again, the Corey text tells you myth doesn't mean that it's some fantastic story made up. A myth in the religious sense it's a story to tell us truth and convey truth. Another aspect to consider when trying to determine the nature of interpreting chapter 1 is to look at Genesis chapter 2. If you look at the creation stories in each of them, they have a different purpose. If you look in chapter 1, the main focus is on God and God's creation, but mostly the character of God. When we get to Genesis chapter 2, there's an anthropocentric focus, a focus on humanity. One of the key issues here in understanding how to interpret Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 is to understand that the order of creation is different. Look closely at Genesis chapter 1 and you'll see that humans are created last. Look closely at Genesis chapter 2 and you'll realize that humans were created before plant material. So, those who put these two stories together understood there was a difference here and understood that you couldn't really take both of these stories literally because one would have to be wrong if it was literal. Okay, so the focus of the text is not to give a play-by-play newspaper type historically accurate picture. And so if the facts don't match, that's not a problem, because what's most important is the theological message behind the text. So when you look at these two texts, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, what's most important in trying to understand what these texts are here for and what they mean is to understand that they're the nature of the text as a poetic text, and also the content or the purpose of the text as a theological document. Well, I hope that helps you understand Genesis chapter 1 a little bit more closely. The issue of how to interpret Genesis and how that relates to evolution has been an issue in the 20th century for many, but it's really not a debate that needs to happen if you totally understand the nature of the text, and I hope this helps you understand that.